our session in continuing with the spirit of campus activism and sort of getting to the meat potatoes of what's going on in the current moment. This panel will carries on in that tradition, but this one features current students or at the very least recent alumni who have been involved in various movements, some of which will be very familiar, but some of them will be a little obscure based on your vantage point, but equally as important nevertheless. The panel is supposed to have 6 people, so I'm not sure if the other folks are not coming or if they are going to be a little late. But if they are, when they do come, they'll just join us and we'll just go from there. Hopefully they're not too late. But who we have today, I'm going to have folks introduce themselves, but we have, to the furthest right, we have Nomzamo Ntombela, who is a former student representative council president at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. If you know, and I'm sure if you didn't know, you might have caught on from earlier sessions, that Stellenbosch would be, during the Apartheid era and until pretty recently, a bastion of the Afrikaner community, safe to say. Mm-hmm. And for her to come in and be president was unprecedented, and so she's remarkable, and we are glad to have her here. Next up, we have Tammy Cervantes of Crew, which I'm tempted to try read the Spanish name, but at the risk of butchering it, and I would, all due respect, she will tell you about it a little more herself. Then next up, we have Natalie Smith, representing Renew MSU. Then she'll also speak a little more about the organization. Then to the furthest left, we have Dee Jordan, who, if you are part of the graduate community like I've been for the past few years, she is iconic. University Enrichment Fellow, and Joe, PhD candidate, and most relevantly to us, former president of the Council of Graduate Students. So this is our panel, and what we're going to do is each speaker will speak for 10 to 12 minutes. Sort of situate themselves, introduce themselves and situate themselves within their activism as students, and talk about just the way the movement has unfolded and sort of obstacles they've faced, but importantly to talk about what connectivities there are between, or points of solidarity there's been between their own struggle and struggles from around the world, if you will, if there's any points of connection like that. If not, we will have them by the end of this presentation. So, Nomzamo, please take us away.
Should I just start it off? Okay, great. Just gonna try to do something here. So I would prefer not to sit for various reasons. I just sort of feel like sitting here and I don't really get to engage with you in sort of like a power thing where I sort of have all of the knowledge. And for me, I'd sort of rather not do that. So if you don't mind me standing, I can put a chair in front of me. I'll just do that rather. Thank you. So I want to start off by reading a quote in a book by Torvin Reddy, who writes on South Africa, settler colonialism, and the failures of liberal democracy. So he writes in his conclusion, and I quote, "Rather than avoiding the pathological features of South Africa's modern pathway or its beginnings of modernity, it seems better to confront them head on. And in good Hegelian and Fanonian fashion, it is possible to achieve brightness from darkness, a lotus flower from the mud, and true freedom and true humanity from racial, gender, and class indignity and oppression. The first step is to be the person who questions. So I think this was something fitting for me to read, because over the past couple of days, I was privileged enough to be here at MSU and to engage with a couple of students and to also sort of try and understand, how do I sort of situate myself and form these, this transnational activism we've been speaking of. Because, when I was asked to come speak here, I was like, okay, I sort of understand it, but I wanted to get an in-depth understanding. I wanted to grasp sort of what is my role, being here, and sort of what do I take back home when I go and I see other people. I don't want to say I went to America, I had a bagel, which is really good, but I wanted to sort of bring something more and sort of say the things we're facing here, the things that we're experiencing, it's not an unknown phenomenon. It's happening everywhere, and what we need to do is sort of try understand the complexities and find a sort of a space where we can unite. But I'm obviously not here to give a motivational talk. I can do it afterwards. So I sort of want to speak about myself briefly, and then I'll sort of go into the movements. So I'm a first-generation student at Stellenbosch University, which you've heard is sort of the bastion of white supremacy and all of those things in South Africa. It looks really great on the outside. Kurt and them have been there; they can speak to that. Aesthetically, it is really, really pleasing to be at Stellenbosch. I don't want to lie. It's really, really a beautiful town. But beyond that, there's a culture, an institutional culture, sort of a culture that excludes people. And when you first arrive at Stellenbosch University, we have this thing, we call it a rainbow euphoria, sort of like this conditioned notion of the rainbow, which for many of us, like myself, is something that we were conditioned into, so sort of through our curriculum at school and things like that. And that's sort of a space where many of us found ourselves in 2015. We got to these institutions where we were supposed to sort of liberate everyone within our family, some of us being first generation students, and we got there, and in a democratic South Africa, there were people saying, I feel like it's a social burden to be black. I would rather die than be black in South Africa, than be black in a space like Stellenbosch University. And these are very harsh things to sort of like digest, because you ask yourself, we've been taught from a young age that, our elders, they fought for this, people from across the world, sanctions and so forth happened so that we could get to where we are. And you sort of can't merge your realities, what you're taught, as you've grown up, and when you get to university, nothing really makes sense. And that's where we found ourselves in 2015, where we said, look here, nothing is making sense. How do we make sense of it? And the rise of Fees Must Fall was firstly a call that was supposed to question access, was supposed to question, exclusion at institutions. We were saying, we're here, you tell us, you want us to come here, you give us bursaries, you give us all of these things, but it's not sufficient. There's something missing. I don't feel human when I'm here. I don't feel like I belong when I'm here. And whether you tell me directly, it's also in the walls. It's a culture. And the biggest thing that we try to do with Fees Must Fall and so forth is to actually say we need to stop viewing apartheid and colonialism as a system where in 1994 we just turned the switch and everything stopped. We need to view it as a culture. A culture permeates, it lasts forever. And the only reason you can address these things is by actually confronting them and being open with them. And we said, we understand that, in 1994, the transition into democracy, there's certain things that our elders did not and could not address. And we were saying we want to take it further. We understand that you could only take it so far, and we want to take it further. And that's when a movement like Fees Must Fall, Roads Must Fall, and Open Stellenbosch also came up. Roads Must Fall was sort of more at UCT, where they brought up the issue of the road statue that was there on campus, and they said, we want the statue to fall not because we're bored and we sort of like are looking for something to do, but we want it to fall because at an institution that you claim to be a world-class institution in democratic South Africa, we have a symbol that represents the oppression of multiple marginalized bodies on campus. And by you keeping this here, you're being hypocritical. You're saying one thing, you're promoting one thing, but in reality, you still have these symbols. And that's when you sort of come to understand that, we're saying it's a culture. Apartheid was a culture in South Africa. And our elders could only take it so far. And what we said is we want to take it further. So we started having these movements like Fees Must Fall, Roads Must Fall, End Rape Culture, and so forth, where it became spaces where we are conscientizing each other. We're sort of wanting to know more about our history, because the history that we were taught and not taught was a history that conditioned us in these notions of non-racialism, equality, telling us that this is the ideal world. But when you leave the classroom and you go home, this is not the world. You can't connect the two. You don't see that you're living in poverty. You don't see that it's a problem. You're happy with it because I have family, I have home. And then you get to your institution and you're told, look here, you're living in poverty, you have X, Y, and Z. You need to do X, Y, and Z. And it creates this cognitive dissonance where you don't know who you are. Where do I fit in? And these are the things that people were bringing up, But what came up in those movements is that women, marginalized bodies, were saying, we're not being heard in these movements as well. And we had substructures such as, radical feminists. We had the trans collective at UCT. There was even a movement that came out of end rape culture. We were saying, but within this institutional culture itself, you perpetuate a culture unto women, unto marginalized bodies, members of the LGBTQI plus community, and we need to have these conversations. We need to sort of take it apart and understand what it means when we speak rape culture, because many people are saying, I can't perpetuate rape culture because I haven't raped anybody, and we're saying, no, it's not that. It forms part of it, but it's what you do, it's what you say. It's what you say to us when you say, we can't be walking around on campus late at night, understandably so, but where the onus falls on us as women, on us as marginalized bodies, sort of be the ones who have to make these types of changes. And with those who are in positions of power, those who are, empowered by just the mere way that society is, don't have to do anything. We have to be the ones sort of continuously bringing up these change. And, it was through such movements that we were able to, some people went and, joined policy-making bodies, where they're able to bring up different policies that address these types of things at institutions. And I think since then, it's been a continuous conversation, because we realize that, 24, 25 years of being conditioned to see yourself in a specific way as a Black person in South Africa, as a woman in South Africa. You don't just undo those things through mere sort of seasonal movements. It has to be a continuous thing where we continuously question, re-question, relearn, and unlearn certain things. So that's my story, and thank you for letting me stand here.
Sorry, just before we go on, I forgot to mention that if you have any questions, please make a note of them. We'll have a good 30-40 minutes at the end, and you can ask our panelists then. Did any of the other panelists walk in maybe when Nomzamo was speaking? Well then, all right, let's go.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tammy Cervantes. I am a junior here at MSU. I am the president of CRU, which stands for Culturas de las Razas Unidas. We are the largest Latino organization on campus. So a little bit about me. I grew up in Southwest Detroit. So if you know Detroit's broken up into different sections. Southwest just so happens to be where all the Latinos live. I grew up in an area where everyone around me was Hispanic, so coming to MSU, it was quite a shock being the only person of Hispanic descent in a classroom where all my peers are white, talking about issues that affected me. But a little bit about CRU. CRU has been around on this campus since 1960-something, although it has had many different names and many different purposes throughout the way along our history here. In 1996 is when we officially became CRU, and around that time is when CRU became institutionalized on this campus. We became an organization that has funding directly from the university and has funding set aside in different university bodies, and so a lot of what we can do tends to be limited, but that has not stopped us. It hasn't stopped a lot of Latinos who have passed this campus. Just in this library, if you go downstairs on the first floor, there's a Cesar Chavez Memorial, which happened because past Latino students and professors decided that if we don't have our history, neither will you. So they rented out all the books from the MSU library, and that's how we got it. And sometimes that's how you have to do things. But now that the position that Crew is in, we've had to do things in a slightly different manner. My freshman year, the first involvement I had with Crew was at the MSU Union when they protested Donald Trump Jr. And at that time, I was 17, and I was just full of anger that this university that I was coming to spend the next 4 years of my life to be educated in was bringing someone that spoke so horribly about not only my people, but of so many different people of marginalized communities, whether they be women, members of the LGBTQ, or members of the disabled community. And so that's how I got started, and I thought that that was the activism role, that was the activist role that I was going to take, someone that was at every protest. And though I am at every protest at MSU, it is not exactly the role that I have taken. I have taken the role, and my organization has taken the role of being activists, sort of behind the scenes, working with the administration, sitting in these long meetings that none of us want to be a part of, because it's the only time our voice will actually be heard, because as much as we can yell and scream, they can just shut their windows. But if we're right in front of their faces, sometimes they just can't ignore us, and that is sort of the role that we have taken. And I sat here and I listened to everything you had to say about how people in Africa have hated having to be Black because of the oppression that they've had to face. And that is very unfortunate, but it's something that I can relate to very much, being from Detroit, and how people don't want to see the oppression that they face, and that they'd rather say that everything's fine and blame it on themselves and blame it on other people of color than to accept that it is a system that has put us in the situation that we are, that it is a system that has worked in a way so that we feel the need to blame others, and not the actual system and not the people that are making those laws, but other people, because we think that their marginalization is the reason that we are also marginalized. But I spoke to one of my mentors the other day about what I should say here today, because it's my first panel and I had no idea what to talk about. And he reminded me that simply being a woman of color, being someone who comes from immigrant parents and a single mother, the fact that I'm on this campus is enough activism. The fact that I'm standing in a place, that I'm sitting here when I'm not supposed to be here, when the system was not created for me to have the opportunity to get an education at a Big Ten university, where most of my family and cousins in Mexico are still getting married at 16, having kids by the time they're 18 and never continuing their education, that this act alone is activism, and that the act of every single student on this campus of a marginalized community is being an activist, just the simple fact that they're here. And how activism takes so many different roles, and how we don't have to be picket signers all the time, although it's important and it's something I enjoy. It's not the only way to do things, and it's not the necessary route. And just making sure that we acknowledge that every action that someone takes on this campus is a form of resistance, simply just being here. Thank you.
Wow, beautifully said. Thank you all so much for being here. My name is Natalie Smith. I'm representing Renew MSU. I have been doing environmental activism on campus. This is my senior year, so going on 4 years. I was recruited as a freshman by an organization called the Climate Reality Project, which I then was a part of for about 2 years, at which point last year, at the beginning of the year, we did a merger with what used to be MSU Greenpeace, and now we are a kind of joint organization that we call Renew MSU. We wanted to focus more on MSU-related activism. It's kind of a hard to talk about where we are right now. It's kind of difficult to explain, because the first 2 years that we were on campus as Climate Reality, or that I was doing activism as Climate Reality, we were running a program, a campaign that Climate Reality had basically told us to run, which was 100% committed. And 100% Committed was a nationwide campaign that Climate Reality did in a number of Big Ten schools and cities all across the country in an attempt to get them to commit to 100% renewable electricity. And there was a lot of ambiguity in the message, but basically that was what we did. For 2 years, I hosted phone banks and rallies and so many different things, and then it actually happened. MSU actually met our demands, which wasn't 100%, which was 100% renewable electricity. It wasn't energy. It was kind of, that's what I mean by the ambiguity. They actually met our demands and have agreed to, by I think 2040 or 2050, will be at least 30% renewable. If you guys have seen the, what are they called? The solar panels over the parking lots by South, that's part of their initiative to go renewable. And then while all this was happening, I think a part of me was kind of like very much blind to a lot of the other environmental issues that were going on. And one of the members of the organization brought us to this realization that we haven't really been grappling with the whiteness of the environmental movement and the whiteness of organizations like Climate Reality Project, which does not advocate for Indigenous rights, which does not support, not actively, doesn't support Standing Rock, but never came out with a statement. And to me, that was a real turning point for how I felt about that organization, to be honest. And I still am somewhat affiliated with them, so I'm not gonna, I think that they do a lot of really good work, and I think they do a lot of really important work, but it was no longer the kind of work that I wanted to do. I visited Standing Rock for a brief time. I wish I could have stayed longer. And I realized that there are so many things that the environmental movement needs to grapple with, both on campus and in the United States and in the world, that we aren't really talking about. And we aren't talking about the whiteness, and we aren't talking about, as organizations like the Climate Reality Project, like the importance of environmental justice for frontline communities and the importance of being on the front line. And so we kind of had to pivot a little bit when we made these realizations, because we were at an e-board meeting and we realized that every single person in our organization was white. And it was a real shock, and it was so, because it was offensive to myself, because I had never really thought about how terrible that is, really, to have an organization that we would say was fighting for all of these issues. And on a surface level, maybe we were, but on a really real level, we weren't actually connecting with the people who have a stake in this in a lot of ways, I think. So we really hadn't reached out to any Native groups or anything, and so it was a really hard thing to deal with as an organization. And so now we exist as Renew MSU, and a lot of what we've been doing this year has been addressing those kind of systemic issues that we started with, which was two basically white organizations coming together to create another white organization. And so right now we have kind of suspended in some ways our advocacy on MSU in terms of pushing them to go more renewable than they had even suggested the other year. And the I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. And we're really trying to make this a much more environmental justice focused organization, and trying to acknowledge our privilege, and to acknowledge the things that have that allow us to exist, but also that will keep us existing with on campus. And so there's a quote in our current logo that Christine actually messaged in the email she sent me that she thought was powerful, and it's spoken to us so many times that I think is really a big part of the energy that we have now, and of the environmental justice in general. And the quote is, by a woman named, oh my gosh, I forgot her name. I think it's Lila Watson, but I don't want to, I think that might be a little bit wrong. But anyway, the quote is, if you are here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you are here because your liberation is bound to mine, then let us join hands. And that's the quote that we put on our logo, and it's something that I have decided to carry with me in all of my activism and in all of the conversations that I have with people, whether they be environmental conversations or just general conversations about the campus culture currently, because I think that is something that is really become so toxic to so many people and so difficult to grapple with and to talk about environmentalism on a campus where we have just experienced what we have experienced. It feels kind of wrong, like especially this kind of like white, like, oh, go renewable, like this kind of, that it started to feel almost gross. And so right now we're in kind of an interesting place. I think it's where we need to be, but I don't want to stand up here and say like, oh, we did all of these amazing things on campus, because we've done things, but I think that there's always so much more to do and so many more people to talk to and organizations to get in contact with. And so I thank you both so much for your comments just now about your organizations and your past. I think it's really beautiful and inspiring, and I really loved what you said about just being here as a form of resistance. I think that that's beautiful. So thank you all so much for being here. Your presence is incredibly valuable and important, and thank you all for all of the things, the activism that you all do in your daily lives. Thank you.
Speak pretty loudly, so I think everyone can hear me. What? Come on. No, I don't like it. I don't like it. Anyways, hi, I'm Dee Jordan. I'm a fifth-year dual doctoral candidate in the College of Social Science in the departments of Geography, Environment and Spatial Science, and the Environmental Science and Policy program. I'm a University Enrichment Fellow, which is one of the highest recruitment awards by our graduate school at MSU. And I was the first woman to be elected to the Council of Graduate Students Executive Board, and then became the first I was the first African-American woman to serve and be elected for the Council of Graduate Students, and then became the first African-American to be the president of the council in its 52-year history here at MSU. I state that. Thank you, but it's also very bittersweet. In 52 years, there should have been shoulders for me to have stood on. So while I appreciate the sentiment and the praise for the accomplishment, it also reminds me that our culture and climate still struggle today, even far removed from the civil rights movement. So for me personally, activism is about your consciousness, which is predicated by your lived experience, and so I want to share with you all a little bit about mine. I'm the child of a multicultural heritage. My grandmother was white and Native American. I'm from the South. My grandfather is West Indian and identifies as Native American. My grandmother had to identify as my grandfather identifies as African American. My grandmother also had to identify as African American, because then in the Jim Crow South, it was better to be an African American than to even have an inkling of your native heritage. That was sombering to our family and representative throughout the thread of our lives. Activism is in my soul. My grandparents crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge on Bloody Sunday. They were in the March on Washington. My uncle was a sanitation worker in Memphis, Tennessee, and my auntie was a Black Panther in Chicago, Illinois. So for me, I take activism, advocacy, and my voice very seriously. I'm extremely passionate about others, otherness, and marginalized people, identities, and trying to find a way for there to be balance in diversity, inclusion, and equity. I think equity is the most important word of all the three terms, because equality won't get us there, but equity surely heck will. So let me tell you a little bit about what brings me here. When I was little, 8 years old, my grandfather and I spent a lot of time together because colorism is very real, especially amongst African groups. I'm one of the darkest in our family. My grandfather, being West Indian, is also one of the darkest. A lot of my family members happen to get the hue of my grandmother. It's a very beautiful caramel, pecan, tan. Sometimes it's really, really light, like latte with extra cream. But my grandfather and I, we're chocolate. And very, very early on, we recognizing that there was this difference, he embraced me and wanted to fortify and make sure I knew that no matter what color I manifest, I was beautiful because I exist. And we spent a lot of time together in my very formative years. I was really my grandfather's favorite, but I won't tell his kids that. But I really was. Back in the South, my grandfather had an 8th grade education. I'm the youngest granddaughter, and he spent a lot of time grooming and preparing me because others were out working or already in school, and so he spent a lot of time preparing me for my entry into elementary school, which, because his 8th grade education loaned so much to me, I was able to start school at 4 instead of 5 because he said she can't stay here anymore. She knows too much and she asks too many questions. You've got to let her in. And after an interview with the school, despite the year date of my birth, which said I could not get into school at that time, they said they had no choice but to let me in. They said one so inquisitive deserved an opportunity. So I exist because I've been provided and afforded opportunities. It has not always been easy, especially when you're a little black girl in the South, and people remind you of that all the time when they say behind polite smiles, she's cute for a dark-skinned girl. That's very loaded and very hurtful, because why can't I just be cute? More importantly, why can't I just be here and exist without all the other labels and the other things that you see? So for me, it has been a plight to speak up for those people who, unlike me, aren't always given a voice. I'm very sensitive to the matters of my international colleagues and peers, especially having served as the president of the Council of Graduate Students. I never thought that there was an issue too insurmountable for us to undertake because, well, I have crazy faith, and I'm a staunch believer that if at the core people can agree, then everything else can be figured out and we can put it together and work towards achieving the ultimate goal. But we have to get people to come to that consensus, which is one of the things I'm known as around campus, as a consensus builder. Why is that important? Because we're never going to win a fight if we're always in our polar corners. We have to come to the center, because in the center, that's where the meat is. How did I learn that? Through hearing about the stories of all the civil rights plans and marches and the things that they were planning at my grandparents' home, and how they had to convince their peers in the neighborhoods that didn't look like them demographically to get on board with this movement. And you have to start with the core of things. If people can't agree that people are all equal and we deserve a fair chance in this world, then you can pull a lot of things together. So here at MSU, that's been a large part of what I've tried to do and achieve, not just for graduate and professional students, but most directly for them, because those were my constituents at the time. But it's not uncommon to see me at an undergraduate rally or at a protest, or adding my voice to stabilize some of the undertakings our students want to pursue, because having been a little far removed, a little older than some of my undergraduate peers, I recognize that there are certain ways in which we can go about achieving our goals that aren't always radical. Not saying that radical isn't necessary, because I'm a disruptor, trust, but we don't always have to move in radical spheres. I consider myself a diplomatic advocate because I do try to go to the table and be very open with my administrators, people in opposition, and usually by the time we finish those conversations, when you put together a well-planned argument, you have a strategy, it's rooted in science and sure facts, it's hard to dispute that if you're sincere about your intentions. So typically by the time that I would leave a meeting or a tete-a-tete to fix things that happen to be broken, that have been broken for a very long time and have become the prevailing culture, typically the people who were opposing me would end up nodding in favor because the points I make are that you don't have to lose so that I win, and I don't have to lose so that you win. But if we decide to come together, we can all win because there's enough for all of us here. The advice that I often give to when I'm asked to speak to groups and people about what it is I do and why I do these things, the advice that I give them is it's hugely important to be known as a person others want to work with. Why do I say that? Because you're going to get more invites, you're going to be asked to the table a heck of a lot more than if you are a person people don't feel will be receptive to any other ideas than that are your own. And recognizing that I don't hold all the answers or the keys to the universe, I have to derive some information from other groups and other parties. And I also have to understand that it's not always the plan that I've put in place or the plans that my colleagues and I have thought would be the best way. Someone else could come along and provide some light that we didn't even think about. It's happened often. But if you don't have a teachable spirit, and if you're not receptive to others and otherness and other ideas, then you're shutting out the very good answers that could possibly help you win that fight. So that's hugely, I think, important. That comes with maturity in the struggles and in activism and in advocacy. For me personally, I do wear my role as an advocate for our students here very seriously. I'm always going to advocate for the safe, supportive matriculation of all our students, because me being the first college graduate in my family, I know that that wasn't the plan and that the system wasn't set up for me to succeed, but that I am here, and not just that it's me, that I also have a son who is a Gates Millennium Scholar, shows me by evidence that we can break the status quo if we are afforded those opportunities in which to do so.
Thank you so much, Dee, and everybody. Joining us now, I'm trusting that you are not Julia. No? All right. Coming up is Ahmad Hamad from the Students for Justice in Palestine. And Ahmad, what we've been doing is just 10 to 12 minutes to introduce yourself and the organization or cause that you are involved with. Then also taking some time to talk about points of solidarity or points of continuity. Now you may have missed some of the other talks, but you know, just that idea of what other movements or causes can possibly assist with or get learn from your cause. So if you can just do that, then we'll do questions immediately after this. So, yeah, please.
Hello, everybody. As he said, my name is Ahmad Hamad. I'm from Students for Justice in Palestine.
Is that mic working?
Oh, it's on. Okay. I'm from Students.
Do you want to use any slides?
I do have pictures, but I think it's a little.
Please do.
Tell you what, we'll be good. Students for Justice for Palestine is a national organization, and we advocate for divestment and boycott of Israel, whose So boycott and divestment, what it is we want MSU to divest from companies that support Israel, because as a Palestinian, Israel is an apartheid state. So I would like to begin off with what is Israel and Zionism. So Zionism is a political ideology based primarily on ethnic identity, which was formed towards the end of the 1800s with the aim of establishing a Jewish national homeland in Palestine. Their motive was to ensure Jewish self-determination and freedom from persecution. So with Zionism, I'd like to bring up the point that sometimes our cause is called anti-Semitic, but in fact we are not. We are anti-Zionist. We do have Jewish advocates for Palestine, such as Jewish Voice for Peace, and there is many organizations within the IDF, and the IDF is the Israeli Defense Force that after serving, they realized the atrocities that was happening to the Palestinian people, so they are trying to call that out. A brief history of Palestine. So my parents were 48, and we call that the Nakba. The Nakba in Arabic, our English translate to the catastrophe, and that was when almost 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from Palestine due to this Zionist movement and expulsion of Palestinians. There was also more than 400 cities, Palestinian cities, that were destroyed by the Zionist movement in the 48. There was also a second Nakba in 67. This was when a lot of Palestinians felt threatened and a lot more moved due to the fact that the Zionist movement started a route in Palestine with the help of British colonists in Palestine. The British gave authority to the Zionist movement, where they created a government, and soon the state of Israel was created. Today, what the Palestinian apartheid looks like is, it's kind of sad. There's a lot more in it in the news recently, which is good. Exposure is what we are hoping for. What the thing looks like, I had slides up, but it was too late. I came in too late, which I apologize for. But we have an apartheid wall. It's over 700 miles long, and there's a wall between the Palestinian and the Israeli side, with the Palestinian side being really underdeveloped because the Israeli sides control our electricity, our water, what comes in and out. I have family in cities where sometimes they're blocked off for 3 months, so nothing can get in or out, and all the rations have to be, all the rations are scarce in there. There's also settlements. Settlements under international law is illegal, yet every day there's settlements being built. There's a major city right now that's protesting this because there's bulldozers demolishing homes, and in some cities, literally, Zionists are living above the Palestinians, so they just come and occupy their home like they did our land. And that's one of the major things we are trying to fight for is, so what we mean by boycott and divestment. So Airbnb is one we are trying to boycott, is because they have houses that they let people want to stay, but it's in Israel, and those houses are on settlements, which are illegal under international law. So that's a problem. So that's one thing we're trying to boycott. Also, prisoners in Palestine. 80% of the prisoners that the IDF take are children. That is one big problem that we've noticed, and Amnesty International and other human rights organizations have called them out, and there is a law in circulation in the Senate right now. It's called HR 4391, and the law basically says if Israel keeps detaining children illegally, that America will stop funding Israel. We are pushing for that because they're children. Their only crimes that they're tried for are throwing rocks, which is a crime in Israeli court, and the children are not tried in civilian courts. They are tried in military court, and they have sentences to 20 to 30 years just for simply throwing a rock. And it is in defense, according to the Geneva Convention. We as Palestinians are under military occupation, and we do have the right to defend ourselves, and one of those ways is throwing rocks. There's no denying that we do. So one thing that Israeli tactics that they use is pinkwashing. Pinkwashing is a cause. Pinkwashing, what Israel does is a campaign. They pump $9 million into a year where they make themselves seem LGBTQ friendly. So they hijack that LGBTQ voice to make themselves seem friendly towards those groups and try to make it a tourist hotspot in Israel. And they have promotional videos on their websites citing that they have gay or queer IDF soldiers serving, but in reality that there's track record showing that they are not gay or queer friendly. There's also greenwashing. Greenwashing is the equivalent, like what they do is they make themselves seem eco-friendly, clean, environmentalist, progressive, and what that does is, it brings tourists to, and that's their goal at the end of the day, is they try to normalize what is happening in Israel by bringing foreigners to come and see, but when reality is they don't see the other side of the wall, the other side of the catastrophe and what is happening to the Palestinians. So what we are and what we do here at MSU is U of M just last year passed divestment, but the board of directors shut it down. MSU, as a Student for Justice Palestine advocate, we do want to boycott and divest as an MSU school, just like we did for South Africa. We would like that to happen for Palestine, but that's our long-term goal. Our short-term goal right now is just to educate. Not a lot of people know about Palestine, and not a lot of people know about the struggle we have as a Palestinian living in the diaspora. So our goal right now is to educate, and that is my goal here today in talking to you guys, is hopefully give you a basic understanding of what Palestine is and what my struggle is. And to talk about connections between us and other groups. South Africa is one. They were an apartheid nation, as so is Palestine. So there's a common struggle there. There's famous Nelson Mandela quotes while he was advocating for the end of apartheid in South Africa. He was also doing it for Palestine, calling out the atrocities happening there. And I mean, as a minority, we have connections with other minorities, whether it be through culture or common goals. So I think outreaching is a big thing we are doing right now, whether it be with other members like Crew, commonalities like the walls. Crew, the Latino community has this big stigma with walls, especially with Trump being in office, and us having an apartheid wall 10 to 12 feet high, blocking us from anything. We have a commonality there. And there's also many black Palestinians that people don't really hear about or really hear their voice. So there's a group in Detroit called the Black Palestinian Union, and they're an advocate for Palestinian rights as black Palestinians. Also, a majority of Palestinians are Muslims, so we do reach out with MSA, but there is a majority, there is also a Christian population, and many people think when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it only involves Muslims, but that is not the case. Churches have been shut down in Palestine due to the Zionist movement in Israel. That's all I have to say.
Thank you so much, Ahmad, and everybody else. I think we are already starting to see a lot of connections, right? I think we saw Tammy talking about how sort of the stigma of being marginalized, how as a Latina in the U.S. resembled some of what Noam Zama was talking about. Then we heard from Natalie about this intersection between politics of race and identity and the environment. Dee chiming in as well and talking about some of these even inter-ethnic conflicts with colorism. Then Ahmad talking about very explicitly about apartheid, right, which is a word that is overwhelmingly associated with South Africa, and then to hear it being used about another space, as well as you're talking about the Black Muslims and the Black Palestinians and then the Muslims Association and the Latino community through this discourse on walls. So I would like to open it up for questions. We have a good just under 40 minutes left in this section. And I think we can perhaps take 3 questions at a time and keep it moving that way. And we have mics, one on this side, another one over here. So please speak into them. This will help us record and project. Questions? Chris, go ahead.
Thank you. I really appreciate every communication, every contribution from the panel. Everybody had some very valuable things to say. I wanted to mention in regard to Tammy, you're talking about different kinds of activism, which I completely respect. I also want to say, you talked about the demonstration against Donald Trump Jr. That was one of the best organized events I have ever attended. And I was extraordinarily impressed by the leadership. It was on the 2nd floor of the MSU Student Union in a very confined space where people had to have tickets to get in to hear Donald Trump Jr. And the protesters were just in the little hallway area next to where these people were going in. And over time, more and more white people came who wanted to get in, and the door had been closed, and so they were standing along the hallway in this tiny confined space. And the courage of the Latina women who were leading that protest, I was just blown away. That the leaders were saying, we are going to have this demonstration in a way where our bodies will not be touched because we are vulnerable, and that's the way it's going to be run. And you had people assigned to deal with the police and said, you will talk to us and we will talk to our people. And there were white people there wanting to be supportive, and the white people were at the back. It was very difficult and very effective and very impressive, and I was very grateful because somebody needed to be there speaking out against Donald Trump Jr. And it was Latina people who did that for this community, and it was very important, and I want to call that out. And to Natalie, I don't know what to say exactly about being a white person wanting to be involved in the anti-racist struggle, except to say it is a lifetime work. And it is not, and being a part of the anti-apartheid movement, that was part of the role I was in there. So I did that for a couple of decades. The anti-racism struggle is still, huge with us now. And it still is very important to me to try to support and be a part of that struggle. And I think, that comment about solidarity is really important. It isn't about, it's somebody else's struggle. It's a struggle about our society, and it's a struggle about humanity. And I think the thing to do is keep at it and be appreciative of other people's work, to be available to support other people, to go to where other people are, to listen to other people's priority, and to try to be supportive and respectful, and just keep at it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for these very important insights. I just have two questions. The first one is, given the social media space that you have and the tools that we did not have, but knowing the dangers of that space as well. In Egypt, the youth lead because they could mobilize against. But when that which they were mobilizing against had collapsed, there was no organized leadership. So the military occupied the vacuum. How do you mitigate against those risks? The second one, what are the distinctive characters? You had different cohorts and generations of leadership, what they went through, how they organized. What is distinct about the activism of this time? And what do you think is the future or future trends of activism? Thank you.
And these are to everybody? Everyone?
Yes.
Okay.
Can I ask you?
Everybody.
Can I ask you a quick follow-up? I'm sorry. When you say the leaders, do you mean like general sort of activism in the world or in the United States, or within our own organizations?
Within your own organization, whatever the cause is, it might have been different in Egypt for something else, and it might be different for you. You might be an environmental activist and so forth. And of course, since you called me back to the mic, I might even sneak the third half question. Is your activism situational because you are a student in a transient form? Or is it something that will go with you beyond
Life.
being a student?
So I'll start. I'll start with your last one first. As I stated earlier, activism is in my soul. It's been with me. I've been indoctrinated in my family over time. I recognized and understood as I was told by my grandparents and hearing the stories of those who would march and rally in support of the civil rights movement during those times. I've also had the luxury of being in space and breaking bread with a lot of civil rights activists who are very notable. For me, there's no option. There's a quote on the Council of Graduate Students site. So I overhauled our website. One of the first things I did as the president, because it didn't represent the demographics at MSU. And I wanted everyone to feel included, and I felt like the best way for them to feel like we were approachable and they could come to us is that we show them and highlight all of our otherness on our website. And there's a quote on there by me, and it says, "Activism, inclusion, and advocacy happen when we all opt in." The people who serve with me on my administration, they recognize opting out of the movement wasn't an option. And I think that's because I grew up knowing that it's my responsibility, it's my duty as a citizen of this world to be an activist and to advocate for different things, depending on what they are, but more importantly, what I believed in. So it will be with me. It's been with me my whole life. My second grade teacher would probably attest to that. But it won't go anywhere. It's being at MSU, and in fact, when I applied for PhD programs, I had a career. When I applied for PhD programs and I was being interviewed, I was accepted by Harvard, Clark, the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, Michigan State, and UNC. And during those calls, I interviewed the people that I wanted to work with. And while MSU wasn't in the running, sorry, go green though, UNC was always my dream school. when I went to Harvard and I did not like the culture and environment, recognizing that I would have to change who I was 180 degrees to fit in, I didn't want to be in a bad marriage, so I had to say no, despite the urging of my family, but I have to, I have the courage of my own convictions, and I think I was right. With UNC, it was my dream school, UNC. It was my dream school because I wanted to be the other famous Jordan that was a geographer at UNC. So when I spoke with the chair, whom I wanted to work with, who was only going to take one student, he was only going to take one, and he wanted me to be the one. He said to me, though, Dee, I want your big data analytics, but I don't want your advocacy. And I said, well, Dr. Inch, you don't want me, because I'm not into splitting myself or divorcing myself from itself, because I have a voice and I like it. And I received a phone call from the folks at MSU who said, we know who you are and we still want you. And then they made an offer I couldn't refuse. So, as far as the leadership and what it takes in those spaces, I will remember in 2014, it was at the heels of the Mike Brown shooting in Ferguson, and students were trying to rally and organize themselves and get together on what our reaction to the actions in Ferguson would look like. And I went to our Black Student Alliance meeting, and it was a meeting of not just the Black Student Alliance, but all these other, affinity and identity groups as well. But what I noticed about being in that space was there was no head. And what I thought, because as a grad student, we're not always extended invites into those spaces. But since I was given one, I thought what would be a good idea was to groom the young leaders and pull the ones aside who called the meeting, right? And let them know that this is your meeting. This is your time. Everybody can't lead. We've got to have the lieutenant. We've got to have colonels and majors. We've got to get this thing in order, or we're about to blow it up here. And instead of letting them implode, I offered advice, shored up and scaffolded and groomed the next group of leaders that they then were able to sit in front of their own peers, corral them and say, listen, let's steady the ship now. That's called course correction. Not a lot of people are willing to offer course correction because we fear reprisal. But being in that space, I felt it was my duty to ensure that they had a good march, good movement, good ideas, but they could hear each other, and that someone was the point so that we can get our instructions from one head. So I think that has to happen often.
Okay, I can take this. So you had a couple questions in there, so I was trying to kind of answer all of them. First of all, I just want to say, I just wrote a comment. I am so just amazed by your strength and your ability to turn down some really, really great offers. I think that is so just amazing to me. I think that that's really powerful and speaks to your character. The first question, I think, was about social media and kind of grappling with that. Not to go into a whole political thing, but last year in 2016, worked for, oh my God, I can't believe it's been 2 years, worked for a candidate that sadly lost the election. And they kept telling us and reminding us that digital is organizing, that it was their bottom line. And you hear that a lot if you go into organizing circles, this idea that digital is organizing. And I agree that there are definitely some drawbacks to social media. But that being said, when it comes to organizing and planning rallies and events and those sorts of things, social media has become the most powerful tool we have ever had to connect people. And so in my experience and from the kinds of social, I have had very few bad experiences with dealing with social media in activism. I've had a lot of bad experiences dealing with my friends and family on social media, but when it comes to getting people in a room, it is truly the risks, I think, have really been outweighed by the benefits. So that was first. The second thing, I think the question about leadership is really, really good because I have a lot of feelings about this. The first is that the head of the Climate Reality Project, which I didn't say earlier, some of you may know this, is former Vice President Al Gore. Why he is environmental advocate, really, like, it goes back to 2005 or 2006 and An Inconvenient Truth and all these things. But really, I don't believe that Al Gore represents the environmental movement. At least he doesn't represent my environmental movement. He's a fine guy, but I would like to see environmental leaders who are minorities, who are women, who are from frontline communities. I think that that is the future of the leadership of the environmental movement. And beyond that, to talk about my own organization, when we made a transition from being Climate Reality Project / Greenpeace to being Renew MSU, we underwent a very severe structural transformation, which was that, so my title used to be president. I am now called the group coordinator. Our core team is now called the executive board. Obviously, these are kind of superficial changes, but fundamentally what we've tried to change is this idea that just because you have a certain title means that you have a certain responsibility. I believe that activism is about meritocracy. It is a beautiful meritocracy, because what you put into it is what you get out of it. And I think that that is so important when we look at leadership and when we look at those structures, is this idea that we should kind of take so much of this, and I think that this is kind of I would argue that this is a very white structure with president and vice president and all these things. And to me, those things actually have very little meaning. And what has meaning is what you put into your organization and the efforts that you're trying to achieve, the kinds of things that you're trying to achieve. The last thing about activism being something that is transient, I would say yes, but I believe that once you're an activist, you are always an activist in your soul. And I really liked what you said about it being something that was in your soul, because I feel that, and I feel that my activism has been transient in so many ways, and I have only become a better, more vocal activist as it has gone on. And I described that transition to a lot of you, where the whole Save the Polar Bears, I could talk about all day about Save the Polar Bears, screw the polar bears, let's talk about people. So in my own activism, in my own beliefs about the environment and what that means to me, this whole idea of tree hugging is another really kind of terrible misnomer that we continue to perpetuate, because we like to forget the fact that that climate change is killing thousands and thousands and thousands of people, and it will destroy our Earth. And we like to forget the fact that there are people who are currently suffering right now because of the effects of climate change, because it's a lot easier to talk about how cute polar bears are than it is to talk about the fact that there is mass flooding and hurricanes, and that people are dying. And one of our old members, he would go around saying, he said, climate change has killed more things than anything, more people than anything. Climate change has killed more people, and it will kill more people than anything ever. And so just even framing it in my own views and how my activism has changed, it has totally transformed. And I hope that it will continue to transform as different movements come to light, and different issues are, that we start to recognize these things. Like my activism, just in how I have thought about sexual assault in my own life, and in terms of the people that I know, and the culture on campus, that has changed. I think it's changed for everybody. So I think part of activism is the fact that it is transformative, and I think that that's really one of the best parts about it. So, anyway.
I just want to say thank you very much for those questions. Very complex, interesting questions. I think just to sort of speak on the social media one, since you're also on the Twitter streets with 10,000 plus followers, I think with the social media one, it's a very I think of it as a very slippery slope to sort of use, social media as a means of activism and as a means of sort of mobilizing people. Yes, it does achieve a means to a certain extent, but it only reaches a certain and a specific type of person as well, which is where I tend to sort of not be as supportive of it as a means of communication and sort of mobilization for people. I think in terms of using it as sort of like the main space of mobilizing has its own, I wouldn't support it, and I don't think it's a very viable means, because like I said, it only gets to a specific class of people. It doesn't get to everyone else. Not everyone is on Twitter, not everyone is on Facebook and so forth. And I really think, it's sort of a challenge that, we face right now as young activists, and perhaps, I don't know if I speak for everyone at the table, of sort of trying to find other means to reach people, not just using social media as that type of platform, because you only cater for the middle class and the upper class as well. People within the lower class don't have access to these types of things. And it also, within that class thing, it also comes with the language that we use on social media. Not everyone is familiar with all of these terms that we use of, patriarchal societies and things like that. So I think it's really a challenge that we have as young activists and, the current generation, that we sort of rethink means of mobilizing and rethink means of reaching people, as exciting as it is, to use Twitter and so forth. For me personally, I'm always conscious and cognizant of the fact that I'm only appealing to a certain audience. And I'm not going to appeal to everyone who would make my activism useless, basically, because, I'm not helping the people who actually need the help. And I think that's the challenge that we currently have. In terms of whether our activism is situational or not, I think, I sort of view it in terms of like, the different classes we have. I mean, if I look at a context like South Africa, for example, and I look at, from 2015 up until now, for many people, activism was sort of situational, given the context that they were coming from. Because for them, activism was a means for them to get social mobility, which many of them wouldn't have had if they weren't within those activist spaces, which, of course, one can critique to a certain extent. But I think that our activism has become more rife now that we find ourselves in these spaces, because before we didn't have the language, didn't have sort of the resources and also the access to the different types of people we can sort of speak to. I mean, I've never in my life thought I'd ever, sit this close and be able to talk to a person like, but through my activism, through being able to engage with different people, I'm able to speak to such people. And that brings me to sort of like, what you said about the leadership and so forth. I think it is through this intergenerational dialogue that we're able to sort of see what happened then, how do we not repeat the same mistakes, and how do we do things a bit better. And I think, as activists in South Africa more especially, it's a challenge for some people given where they come from and where they want to see themselves, which is perhaps not the same for everybody given their context. But I think it's a challenge and a call for us to have more intergenerational dialogues and to come into those dialogues with mutual respect and understanding of the fact that, we're not just trying to destroy things, and we shouldn't just be destroying things. We need to have a vision for beyond that. And the only way we can achieve that vision is by seeing and understanding where we've come from as young people who find ourselves within these situations that have brought up these types of things we could not voice before we got to these spaces. I hope I've answered your question sufficiently, Mentor.
I would like to specifically answer the social media question. As a Palestinian, our organization really does not emphasize media, and that is due to because repercussions we do have while saying stuff on social media. There's a website called Canary Mission, and it does call out Palestinian activists, and it makes them seem as though they are terrorists or they are anti-Semitic in ways. And that does have repercussions from grad programs we are not be able to get into, to medical schools, to certain jobs. I mean, because if you search, I'm not personally on there, but if you do search some of my friends' name, there's a picture portrayed which is not the whole truth. So as Students for Justice in Palestine, we do not use social media that much because our words are manipulated and twisted in ways that are not meant to be, and we do not have that voice to reach out and let people know that is not what is happening. Example, there's a convention that SJP holds nationally, and you have to get vetted to be in there, and it's a long process because as I said, a lot of the things we do say are misrepresented to seem anti-Semitic or just many ways racist towards the Jewish population in any way we are not. So social media for us is not a strong platform. It's usually by the word of mouth. People we know, they know, and that's how we build a stronger bond, because that's the way we make connections, because we're constantly texting each other and making sure that we do mobilize, but social media is not one of the ways we do that.
Can I ask, what are some of the alternatives that you use? Maybe to...
A big thing is WhatsApp. But that is still a platform for the middle class, because you need to have a phone or a laptop. But just word of mouth, people we know, and many of the people you hang out with are the people that, like, I hang out with a lot of Palestinians, so those are the people I'm going to tell, and then those people are going to tell their friends and their friends. So I think
the only reason I ask is because I've heard so much about SJP. You guys do fantastic work, but I just realized when you said that I've never seen anything on social media, so I was wondering where I even heard those things.
we do post like our meetings and stuff like that, but anything major like organizational efforts are not on there because they usually do get hijacked, and we don't want that.
It's really interesting. Question.
Any more questions? Dr. G.
Well, I first want to thank each of you for your presentations, which were very enlightening to me and informative. This morning we had 2 panel sessions about on which my peers, my age group, talked about the activism in the 1960s and 70s and the anti-apartheid activism and movement. And the point was made that a new generation of activists like yourselves, I think they said something like what the new generation of activists might do. And then another one of the people in that discussion said, no, what we should do, elders from the 60s, what we should do is ask the new generation, what is it that they need? What is it that they want? How can we help them? What is it that they would like to get from us? Instead of telling them. And there's a story that's circulated about the Black Lives Matter. A good friend of mine, who's also a well-known activist, I won't call no names, but y'all will know when I tell the story. And he went in there and was telling him what they should do, and blah, 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 blah. And he's from that generation, and they turned totally away. So, with that kind of preface, my question is, from what you all know of the activism of the 60s and 70s, like in my generation, the Black Power movement that I was in, or the anti-apartheid, or even the very beginning of the feminist movement, which I was in the 1970s. From that experience and that history of different groups, what is it that you all see as beneficial that you can learn from, whether it's something to do or even to not do? What can you gain from that history that will help you or give you some greater understanding of how to navigate you all's world now in the 21st century?
So I can start with that question. I've gotten the opportunity to meet a lot of really amazing Chicano activists back in the from the Sara Chicano movement that worked alongside with Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, and I feel like a big issue that happened with many of the movements that occurred back in the 60s was that they weren't connected. There was the civil rights movement, there was the women's rights movement, there was all these different movements, but they were in different situations. Even though behind closed doors, many of them knew each other, many of them were close, many of them supported each other, at least, for example, the Poor People's Campaign. In the front lines, they weren't united, they weren't together, and that's definitely something that we have to change. Not only fighting for ourselves, but also making sure that as a new generation that we fight for our brothers and sisters in different, maybe if the issue doesn't pertain to us, because no one group can advance without the other groups advancing with them. And I feel like that is an issue that occurred in many older movements, and that is still an issue, is just us closing ourselves off to, I am this one thing, and that is one thing I'm going to fight for. I personally, Latinos are not one color. They will trick you into believing that they all look like me with slightly brown skin and brown hair, but I have a brother that's pretty red. I have a little brother that's Afro-Latino. I have a little sister that's half white. We are every color, shape, size, and we are everything. And if we only close off to one identity, and that is only identity that we advocate for, then we're not going to advance. The big issue with the women's rights movement was that it was a movement only for white women at the beginning. And it excluded women of color, and women of color didn't join the women's movement because they were too busy working on the movements for their own color. They were too busy trying to advance people of African American descent, so they wouldn't work with the women's rights movement. And the issue with the Chicano movement and the migrant worker movement is that they wouldn't advocate for immigrants because it wouldn't benefit them. So we have to make sure that we are fighting for everyone, whether it benefits us or not. And I feel like that's one of the best things that we can do to move forward and move these movements along, so that it's not just about one person, it's about all of us together.
Yeah, really quickly. Sorry, you leaned forward. I didn't. First of all, thank you for all of your activism. Just incredible. In the 60s and 70s, I think that's amazing. There are days when I'm jealous of those movements because they did so many and accomplished so many incredible things. And sometimes when you're actually doing it, you're forgetting about all of the things that you've accomplished. So. Yes, I think to speak to your point, and I think intersectionalism has become truly one of the groundbreaking and important centerpieces of what I see as contemporary activism. But beyond that, I think, like, in terms of things that we have learned and can learn from older movements is the things that have been successful, the successes that they had. We've talked a couple times about the South African divestment that MSU did, and I don't know if everybody in the room knows this, but basically I can't remember what year it was, but it was in the 60s, presumably. And there was a huge divestment campaign at Michigan State. It was probably one of the most successful campaigns we've ever had. And a group of MSU students managed to convince the board to divest from African stock, which at the time was 90% of their investments. And divestment is an incredibly tricky and difficult thing to do, especially if you've worked on divestment campaigns, because oftentimes a lot of those stocks are caught up in 10-year agreements, and it's all these messy things about why they can't do it. And so it was incredibly powerful for MSU to be the first university to divest from that stock, and 90% they pulled 90% of their money out. And that's amazing. We still do divestment today. Like those things that have been effective and that have mobilized people still mobilize people. not all the time. Sometimes we have to change our messaging a little bit. Sometimes we have to change little things. But a lot of like what we've seen in the 60s and 70s has laid the groundwork for what we do today and the kind of movements that we still are trying to, the kind of things we're still trying to accomplish. So thank you all I know you two are both activists. Thank you all again. I love activists. I love this room. It's a good group.
So I want to.
I'm going to let you in, but let's just be quick with this so we can get maybe one or two more questions before time's up. Yeah.
So what I take from the movement of the past movement from the 60s and the 70s is the community organizing component. They didn't have social media. I personally am not on social media because, well, I like to talk to people and I like to engage. So it's just not the format that's going to work best for someone like me. But what I noticed most about the stories were going to people's houses, going to the churches, going to the community centers, having that face time and being in space and sharing time with people, not just sending out a message without knowing or feeling or having the feeling. I can't feel your emotions when I just see strings of text. But when I can go to your house, knock on your door, you see me walking down the street, you see me canvassing, you can have a conversation with me, and that dialogue may spark a change in you about your idea, your current position, or other things. And it may also change my position about things. So there's this bidirectionalness in having dialogues. And I think people get away from that because we've become so accustomed to now firing off a tweet or posting a flyer on Facebook or however they do it. I had a team that would do it because we had to be relevant, but that just wasn't my style. I'm an intentional neighbor. I want to know the people who live next to me, the people in my community. I want them to know my position on things. I want to know theirs because through that, we can start change. I also want to correct the narrative of my colleague Tammy. In fact, black sororities, particularly Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, did participate in the women's suffrage movement. In fact, they were the first black organization to name an unsung hero in Eleanor Roosevelt. Why? Because they worked hand in hand with her on the women's movement. So it's not that because people have different demographic states, they couldn't come together. There were black women who were fully engaged and participated in the women's movement. Not only that, the National Council of Negro Women, headed by Dorothy I. Height, also participated in women's suffrage and women's movement in Washington, D.C. in 1913 when black people didn't have a lot of money and they were paying 10 cents in the door to have members come and pull their monies together to, have a stake in that. So I want to make sure the narrative isn't just that, well, if you don't look like me, I can't help you, or that in the past that didn't occur, because I know historically that it did. More importantly, if we fast forward to 2016, when I was president of Council of Graduate Students, I stepped in and helped CREW. When CREW had a protest in the Student Affairs and Services building, they were protesting some censorship by ASMSU, their governing body. I walked in and asked who the leaders were, and I met a most dynamic young lady. Her name was Macy Rodriguez, and she is just a gem and a half. And I approached her, although undergraduates were not my domain as taxpayers to me. I went to her and I offered her, I wanted to know if they were okay and if they were fortified enough to continue the good fight, because my people were met with hoes and water hoses and dogs and billy clubs and guns when they would protest. I said, I want to make sure you guys have food and water and fortification to move forward. Are you hungry? Are you thirsty? Because I want to make sure you can keep that fight going. And we went and brought and took things to them, because I said somewhere in history we have to change what's happening. We have to start coming together and supporting each other through these protests, and that change had to start. And if it hadn't started before, it started with us that day.
We are right at time. My higher-ups, can we do a few more minutes? We can do a few more minutes, right?
Because he has questions.
All right, sounds good.
I suggest that we just roll this straight. This is meant to roll straight into
Okay.
open mic. So if you just want to pass the moderating over to Dee.
Dee, all
And we
right.
can start off with Dave then.
I know.
Well, yeah, I'm going to hand over to you, but I want to acknowledge that you had your hand up. So if we can have...
Keep moderating. I can keep asking questions.
Right. The answers, we'll finish the answers, then we'll go to Dr. Wiley, then we'll go over here, then I'm
And
done.
then keep going with whoever wants to keep speaking.
All right, so now you can just come up to the mic thereafter.
So I guess now.
I guess I'm fired.
You're not fired. You did great.
And I'm actually
I'm going to be moderating, so.
Yes, what you do? What you want?
I can go up there. It's fine. Now,
Yes.
I give talks.
Okay.
But no, I'm actually the founder of Advanced Geography University Program, so I fund scholars to come here and educate.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tiffany Caesar, and I'm so excited to be at this conference right now. I just want to say that the events don't even end here at the open mic. Our guest from South Africa, Nomzamo, is doing another event tonight at 6 o'clock for women only, and it's about women in activism, and she's going to discuss some of the sub-movements that have been created, like hashtag end rape culture, hashtag are you reference list. So women, guys who know women, please come out tonight from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. in the International Room 201, where we're going to have an intimate discussion about women and activism globally. Also, Dr. Marsha McDowell will be there. She will be talking about the Teal Project and the symbolic rationale behind making quilts for the Nasser victims, and we may even have an exhibit of one of those quilts as well. So please come out and support your fellow South African activists tonight at 6 p.m. in International Center 201. Also, next week, I think the week after next, October 8th, we're going to roll on over to another conference, the Nelson Mandela Symposium, in which Clarence George III, can you wave your hand, and I, as well as Dr. Dewhurst and Dr. McDowell are planning, and that is a student-led event. So we have a series of events that are happening on October 8th. You can get these flyers outside. Please get these flyers, because I walked all the way over to the African Studies Center to make sure you all had these flyers. All right, thank you so much. Thank you.
All right, because Dr. Smitherman is going to kill me if you don't answer her question. Let's get back to this.
Okay.
I think for me, I think a problem, not a problem perhaps, but perhaps something we don't note as young activists is that sometimes we intellectualize activism to a large extent. So we speak of, decolonization, we speak of intersectionality, and we speak of all of these other things, which are very relevant and necessary. But I think what happens is that we sort of lose the connect. So we sort of situate our activism to sort of a specific class of people, and sort of a specific group of people who understand that language we're using, who understand the terminologies and so forth, and we aren't actually able to sort of advocate for people who actually sort of, when we speak of feminism, we sort of use all these big terms, heteropatriarchy, and all of these things, but we don't know and we don't push ourselves to be able to communicate and connect with people who are actually most affected by these types of things. And I think, like what Dee said in terms of what we can learn from people who came before us, is that we need to realize that there's more to activism than just sort of speaking to our own people. We need to go out into communities. We need to find a way to make the language that we're using accessible for the everyday ordinary person. Because right now what we're doing, and I I know I find this a lot in student movements in South Africa, I don't know if it applies anywhere else, is that we were using all of these big terms. We were saying we want to decolonize, institutional culture, which are all very relevant and necessary. But when it came to sort of speaking to, the cleaner in the residence, for example, and she asked, what is decolonization? You sit there and you're like, oh, okay, so decolonization. And you don't even know where to begin because you've intellectualized something to such a degree, and we need to learn how to break those down. We need to make our activism relevant for the everyday person because, we find ourselves in these spaces where we want to break down systems of privilege and so forth, but we end up being confined in them. And I think that's what we need to learn. We need to learn how to speak to the everyday ordinary person and be able to form connections that go deeper than, Wi-Fi and broadband and things like that.
I think that's a very important point, is accessibility of what it is we say. And it's interesting, we're here at a Research One institution saying we should make language more accessible when we're all being trained to do exactly the opposite and have more elite, but most often we are encouraged to be elite speakers or to speak in these pedagogical ways in which to relay our ideas. And case in point, the first couple of words you learn when you step on foot here, at least in the College of Ed and AAAS and other spaces on campus amongst my friend groups who were in the Black graduate students, is ontological and epistemology. And I was like, what the hoodoo? What happened? And that was a barrier that shouldn't be created. I think that's a falsehood. So I'm very intentional in my writings, and I had to explain that to my advisor, that I won't use terms and phrases that are inaccessible to people like my grandfather who had an 8th grade education. My work is work of the people, so it needs to be able to be read by the people or for some person to be able to read it to another group. And since I work with mostly marginalized groups in sub-Saharan Africa, I can't speak above where they are. The Bible says that the Lord will meet you where you are. So why don't we as educated people try to meet the people where they are so we can make things better? Gentleman to my right.
Thank you, Dee.
Could I make one quick point? My apologies.
I just want to continue on with that. If you're looking for examples of movements that do speak to people where they're at, look at movements of youth in non-elite settings. I'm thinking of movements against police brutality by youth in Chicago, the Black Youth Project, Project NIA. A lot of those movements that were started by high school kids, college-age students organizing high school kids, educating them, and then them going out into their community and educating other people and organizing mass protests and such. So definitely look there to start.
Gentleman to my right, sorry for the interruption.
Just a word of thanks to Shingi and your wonderful panel. Thank you very much for very insightful. I have a specific question at the end of that panel I want to address first to Ahmed, and then to broaden it to the rest of you at MSU. Ahmed, as you know, we've recently learned that there is a bill in the U.S. Senate that makes it a felony to advocate a boycott, divestment, or sanctions against Israel in the struggle. And our Democratic Senator Gary Peters has signed on to that bill along with 20 or 30 other co-sponsors of it. Kristen Gillibrand of New York signed on as well, and when she found out that it probably is unconstitutional to begin with and is a bad idea in general, has withdrawn her co-sponsorship. So my question is, to what extent is your organization getting involved in electoral politics to address the positions of Michigan senators and congressmen in Washington like this? And then beyond that, I'd like to ask the rest of you whether or not you're getting yourselves involved in electoral politics in this season to the run-up to election, when the big movements like Voters Not Politicians against gerrymandering and the women's movement are deeply involved in seeking to elect certain congressmen, especially in this time. And is that something that you can cooperate on it in electoral politics? Yeah.
Thank you for asking the question. In regards to my my organization's stance on getting involved in government, we are not, but there is a separate organization that does work. It is for Palestinians to get in local government. It's called AMP, Americans and Muslims for Palestine. They do have a yearly conference where I do attend that too, where we do go to Washington, D.C., and we do go talk to senators and representatives about bills like H.R. 4391, what does make supporting Israel illegal if they keep detaining children. So no, SJP in itself does not do any governmental work because we've found out that one thing the common people don't know is Palestine. If you ask people what is Palestine, not many people know, and if they do know, they don't know what circumstances we're under and what is happening. So we primarily focus on education. Our movement is kind of new. It's not, I mean, apartheid has been happening since 48 in Palestine, but my parents weren't activists themselves because they realized that they needed an education before they can advocate. So that's why I'm here, because they got the education and so am I, but I'm also advocating. So we are new in that process where we are not getting involved in government because we have to take steady steps, and one of those steps right now is educating and social media awareness of what is happening in Palestine.
Just to shortly answer your question, my organization itself does not necessarily get involved in electoral politics. A lot of that has to do with climate reality status as a 501c3. However, we've been working very closely this semester with the Ban Fracking campaign. If anybody wants to petition for ban fracking, to ban fracking in Michigan. So ballot initiatives we've worked on in the past. We kind of refrain from getting into partisan politics as much as possible. Because of the 501c3 status, and because oftentimes I think it's maybe a little redundant or counterproductive sometimes. But there are definitely ways that I have in my personal life. I used to work for Hillary Clinton. Like lobbying for the Sierra Club. We do a lot of these sorts of kind of initiatives, but when it comes to partisan politics, we don't necessarily endorse Gretchen Whitmer or anything, because we've thought about it and we've had conversations about it, and we may continue to do that in the future, but right now it doesn't really seem crucial to our mission. We think we can do different kinds of activism.
CREW also is a nonpartisan organization, so us advocating or being directly involved in politics is very hard for us in that sense. I personally also work a lot in politics. I've worked in either on a campaign or an elected official nonstop since the summer of last year, and I was in DC this summer, so I personally do it and I'm never not doing it, but as an organization we are not allowed to.
I would like to answer.
Mom will go first, and then you can go back.
I think for your first question, that doesn't really apply to me, but I think I'd like to challenge, the people who are involved in sort of these electoral, I don't know what you call it here in the US, structures and things like that. I think this is actually a call to allyship, because as he's mentioned, I think also there's many complications and complexities that sort of come, as a marginalized person to go into these types of structures, because you need people to vote for you, need people to actually sort of put you in those structures before you can actually advocate and speak for these things. So I think it's sort of a challenge for allyship for people who do find themselves within those structures. And if you know someone who's in those structures, to be like, hey, by the way, this is going on, in the Israeli Apartheid state, and this is sort of what's happening, when you go to that state, I don't know what they do here, state Congress meeting, I don't know if they such, but raise this type of thing. It's a sort of a call for the allies, who find themselves in these positions of privilege and power, sort of go to these spaces and raise these types of things and say, I heard about this at the divestiture conference. Do you know about it? What is the state doing? Are you? So I think it's a challenge more so, because like he said, they can only educate for now, but it's up to allies to take that education further and sort of act until they can also be in positions so they can act. And then I think in terms of their involvement. So we have elections coming up in South Africa next year. Very interesting time we find ourselves in. And I think for me, in Fees Misol, we were saying that we're non-partisan and all of these things, which was sort of a call for us to be united. But I think that I'm speaking from the South African context, I think that to be non-partisan sort of like works to a certain extent, but within that non-partisan sort of space, there needs also to be an education and conscientization of saying, notifying people that these are the people we have running, for these types of structures. This is what these people stand for, and sort of notifying and sort of educating people on what these different structures are, because as young people, we do need to actually vote. We can't just sort of call out the problems, and then election time comes and then you're not going to vote, because how can we sort of really affect change? We tire ourselves out by continuously calling things out, and then when it comes to the ballot box, which is sort of a tool in our democratic systems that we find ourselves in, we don't actually go vote. So I think within these spaces, these non-partisan spaces, there also needs to be, it's not necessarily saying, okay, candidate X comes from this party and things like that, but it's saying that these are the issues we have within, our country, within our state, wherever you may be, and, saying to people, when you look for a candidate, look at the fact that are they addressing these things for you, so that we have an active youth, within our democracy itself, because it sort of defeats the purpose of being a democratic state as young people. Call out the problems that we find in this democratic state, and then the one tool that we have in a democratic state, which is to vote, we don't utilize.
Oh, that's here too. That's a big problem that we have in the U.S. as well. I've been voting since I was 18, and I also have a rule amongst my friends that if you don't vote, don't call me to complain, because you don't get to sit on the sidelines and complain when you have an opportunity to go out and voice the change you want to see. So, Ahmed, you had something else you wanted to say?
Yeah, I would like to tie in the previous question with the new question. You asked what the older generation could do for us younger generation, and that is support us financially.
You focus.
So some of MSU, there's a Cores and Cops group, if you guys know what that is. It's a place for minorities or like minority groups, but one of the conditions is they have to be nonpartisan. And Cores and Cops does receive support for their programs. And as I said, you have to be nonpartisan. So as an SJP, we can't get funding from MSU because we are nonpartisan. We are partisan. So we do have lines that we say we speak for our members. So I feel like when the older generation offers like money, because we do need money to everything in America needs money. So I feel like if we had more financial support, then more groups would become partisan and speak about the wrongs in our democracy. But until then, as I said, money and a voice, usually, especially with the Palestinian or the Middle Eastern culture itself, there's a disconnect between the older generation and the new, being that the older generation thinks of us as kids and inexperienced. So usually there's two different groups. Usually the students meet and the older generation meet, but in reality we need to combine those efforts because we could get a lot more done.
So for those of you who are not familiar with the terms Cores and Cops, Cores, the Council of Racial and Ethnic Students, Cops, the Council of Progressive Students. They're both programs that are housed in our Student Affairs and Services. So I just want to make sure that we speak accessibility so you know what we're talking about. Young man to my left.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you again, panelists, and the moderator, the first one who got fired.
He did not get fired.
So I'm very, very happy that the issue of access was brought up, because that is, I think, the biggest hurdle to jump in the modern day activism, right? So my question to the panelists is, within your specific movement, what are deliberate actions you are taking to create access to not only the intellectual aspect of your movement, but participatory access to the movement, right? Because one of the biggest challenges, and speaking from personal experience, is being an African, because black students see me as an African and not as a black student, right? Is that how do I engage in pro-black activism as an African student? Because even if I want to, the space must be welcoming for me to even engage, right? And so how do your movements deliberately, even with the movements in South Africa, how do your movements deliberately create those access points, right? That even within a meritocracy of activism, that there are healthy expectations of all participants, right? That I don't only look at a participant and say, hey, like I was in the streets protesting, you weren't, so I have more credibility than you, but we create a system of equity that allows people to have healthy expectations of participation within activist movement.
So in Crew, something that we decided to push for this year is to change the narrative, because Crew as an organization started off as a Chicanx organization, which Chicano means someone of Mexican American descent, which excludes all Latinos from the rest of Latin America. So moving from that and becoming Crew, it's the United Races. So that's what we were trying to do. But ultimately, we still remained an organization of primary Mexicans. I am Mexican American. So the biggest thing that we tried to do, and going back to what you were saying, is making sure that we are not creating the system where there are minorities within a minority, where we are hearing the voices of people from other places of Latin America, because the Latino voice, the Mexican voice tends to be the overpowering one, and it can, in a way, it shields other Latinos from the hatred, because when situations happen, it's always those Mexicans. But it also takes away the visibility of their issues. For example, when the child separation thing, it wasn't Mexican children. There were Mexican children, but it wasn't, the majority were not Mexican children. They were children from Central American families, and the narrative was, from outsiders, is those Mexicans, when they weren't. And it takes away that visibility. So being mindful as the majority within your minority, that you allow and you create a space where you say it, that not every single person in this group looks exactly the same, is the same. We are a diverse within our own group, and also reminding people that they don't have to be on the front lines all the time. That is why we have our executive boards. That is why I am the president of my organization, so that I take that full force of myself and my organization, and I speak for my community, because not everyone has to do it. There's a lot of Latinos on this campus that can't afford basic necessities like soap, because of the poverty they come from. There's a lot of migrant workers on this campus whose parents can't afford to support them, so they don't need the extra stress of having to advocate for themselves. So just reminding everyone that you don't have to do it, because sometimes there's people like us, like myself, like my e-board, that are willing to do that, because we just understand that not everyone has the financial ability to do it.
So I know I'm a moderator, but I want to speak specifically to your points about African and African American and that intersectionality here at MSU, because that's part of your question. So I think planting the seed of inclusivity really, really helped on those fronts for us, specifically in recent years. Coming here in 2014, there was a big separation. We had Africans and African Americans, and there was this cultural separation, because African Americans were told that Africans didn't feel like we were pure enough, so we weren't really Africans and we can't identify with their struggles, and vice versa. And so it happened on both sides, and the groups were not talking. So as a result, we end up with the Black Graduate Students Association and an African Graduate Student Association, which came along a couple years later, I think in 2016. When that happened, the separation became so apparent that we couldn't ignore it anymore. So we started working very intentionally on getting the groups together, having coffee times, coffee hours, and discussing those very hard truths and those biases that each group had of the other. And now they continue those. They continue to come together. We have a lot of our African graduate students at the Black graduate student functions, and we go out and support all the African student functions, whether it's grad or undergrad, because we recognize that we were only hurting ourselves. But I think it comes to that this intentionalness that I was talking about. We have to be intentional about neighboring with people and embracing the other beyond the difference, right? And most recently, we had a Nigerian festival. So no, I'll go another further. So earlier this year, they had Ubuntu, which brought, say it right, see, that's okay, I'm okay with you correcting me. Say the name of it again. That. So we had that. There was a meeting of African, Caribbean, African American. It was amazing. And I had friends. I wasn't able to go myself, but I received about 25 text messages. I didn't know what was happening at MSU. I thought something had went down and I needed to get that red eye back so we can shut it up. We can shut things down. But this was actually a really good thing. It's the first time in my tenure here at MSU that I received a whole bunch of text messages, and it was for a good thing. So that program was remarkable. I understand lots of students signed up at Spartan Remix, and when people see the word now, people want the t-shirt. So I think that was intentional. Whoever the brain whisperer behind that, they did an amazing thing to bridge that difference between those African identity groups, which is what we are. Any one of you want to take a stab at it?
Yes. So it's in our name. We're Students for Justice in Palestine. We are not Palestinian Student Association. So we advocate for Palestinian rights, and you don't have to be Palestinian for that. We're not a cultural organization. The president here at MSU for SJP is a gay Jewish female. So access points, and we're just education. So we educate on what is happening, and we do reach out. I think that's another way to have access points to your organization, is reaching out to other organizations like BSA and Crew and letting them know it's not just a Muslim or a Middle Eastern thing. It's a human rights thing.
You know, I want to say one more thing. You asked about how do you find out about this stuff. That's a really, really good question. We've tried several different formats. We have group me's that are available, and we try to pass the word about all the events through the group me's and hoping people will pass it on to their constituents. We try to get information to the I3 office. That's the Intercultural Inclusion Initiatives Office, so that they can spread the word, get things to the library. It still plagues us how we get the word out, even if you don't want to be an active participant, but you want to be aware so you can pray, because sometimes when you're doing the activism things, you need a bunch of folks praying in the background for you. I mean, I'm just saying, it's real, right? So, I mean, even that, so you've kind of caught me there, because there's no really good way. I mean, yeah, social media is one of the ways, but then I know that some students don't always know about which groups they should follow or not follow. I will say, from the grad student perspective, because they had a very intuitive leader, she tried to create a resources page where every grad student, we encourage new grads. We have the grad school including us in their information to new grads. Go to our page, because the resources page has, I mean, everything you should know about life at MSU and what you should do and when and what groups we have available. And we connect to the Student Affairs and Services website. We connect to the I3 website. And we have a list of all the other groups that impact the grad student life, or groups that have been open and in their constitution and bylaws say they're inclusive of grad bodies. Those are on our page. So we're trying. It's a work in progress. Anyone else?
I think
Yes, we have another question.
I wanted to say this because as a former director of a student activities program at a college, I've heard a number of times people saying, well, we can't do this and we can't do that in terms of policy. And I want you to know that there's been a lot of changes in policies, particularly as it pertains to 501c3s. Now, they didn't change it for us. They changed it because for many of the things that they wanted to advocate, some of the conservatives and others. And so when I know that there's a book probably for student organizations and what have you, but I also would advise you to do some research about what are the current policies about some of the issues that you've talked about, you know, with the IRS and the 501c3s, because a lot of it has changed. There was a time when you couldn't have somebody political in the pulpit. You can now do that. And so I would just behoove you all to change or have your student leadership that is over organizations to look at that, because there's a lot more things that you actually can do in advocacy that formerly you couldn't. Okay, and the other thing I would tell the young lady that deals with the environment that I thought about, there was a first leadership conference on environmental racism for people of color. Okay, that was in like 1991, and I'm from Detroit, by the way, Cruz. Oh. Okay, and so and there's been a second one, and so you might want to contact some of those folks. You will Google it, you know, to find out where some of those folks are.
Could you tell me what it was called again? The environmental.
It was
conference?
the first leadership conference on environmental racism for people of color. And as a matter of fact,
it was organized by Bob Bullard.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, he's
he
my
was
mentor.
a professor at U of D then. I mean U of M.
He was my mentor. Really?
Okay, so you can pass along some information, but I just wanted to say that. But I really want you all to, because as I'm listening to you, what happens a lot of times with advocates is that we talk about what we can't do and what's blocking us. And there's a whole lot that you actually can do, and we cannot assume that this is correct. We have to go and do the research to find out what it is that you actually can do. And that's for all of you. Okay, thank you. And I've thoroughly enjoyed you. I need to say that.
Thank you. I think that's an important point, too. I know we have a lot of administrators here. I know our administrators get a lot of flack, but having worked with most of them, I know that we have a lot of them who their goal is to reduce the barriers to what it is we want to do. I mean, sometimes the things we cook up at 3 a.m. in the morning, that they would even entertain us and have a conversation with us about those things, speaks a lot to their openness to hearing students and allowing us to, you know, kind of spread our activism wings and natures a bit. So I think sometimes I think we complain a lot about what's wrong here, but we're often doing that in rooms with crown molding and hardwood floors with administrators who actually have a conversation with us on a regular basis. So we have to recognize and honor that, and seek out those who want to reduce the barriers to you getting ahead. But that was an outstanding point. Other questions? I know you guys are tired because it's been a long conference, but this is the good stuff, right? This is the good part of it. Questions going once? Going twice? Dr. Munson, we have no other questions on the floor. Do you have some inspiring words for us?
I just want to thank everyone for this amazing event. I have to apologize. I haven't been able to be here for much of the day. With many other visitors. The president of Liberia.
Oh, nice.
But this event resonated. Everywhere I went today, from morning till evening, people were talking about how moving, how historical, and how hopeful this has been, and that's just a tribute to each and every one of you. So thank you all for coming, and let's keep it together and keep going.
Well, before we go, so don't think you're out yet, I have a few announcements. There's always work to do. So I was given these pencils from the original Divest Africa and Apartheid protest, so please feel free to grab a few pencils and share them with some other folks. And I'd like to give you a little, just some parting words. It's a quote from my granddad. Again, he's very impactful in my life. And if you saw my video on diversity and inclusion, you would have heard this quote before. He said, "Never follow where others dwell. Create your own path and leave a trail." So that's for all of you.
Can I also just get this last word in?
Yeah.
Please, 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 if you engage with social media, I know my man here doesn't because it's dangerous.
I don't.
I'm joking. But if you do engage with social media, please follow us on African Studies Center on Facebook. This is where we share all these events that we have. We also have a Twitter, but Facebook and Twitter. Please follow us on those pages. That's where we share these events and the pictures that we take at them and such. So, thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Just so inspirational.
Yeah, please.
I'd like to take some because we have these South African visitors coming next.
And if you follow us on there, I'll share the YouTube page that you can also follow to see these things. MSU ASC
And then that's it.
on
Plus, I
YouTube.
work at the MSU Museum, and we have
Oh,
we
you
need
should put
one.
this. You should put, no, you should get the green one though for MSU Museum.
Yesterday.